The fine arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, and I knew immediately that my day was about to go sideways. I pulled out the certified letter from the Meadowbrook Pines Homeowners Association, and my stomach dropped as I read the bold print at the top: Violation Notice and Fine. My name is Harrison Keller, and I have been a registered nurse in the cardiac care unit at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, for the past 8 years. I bought my modest 3-bedroom house in the Meadowbrook Pines development 2 years ago, thinking I had found the perfect quiet neighborhood to come home to after long, exhausting shifts at the hospital. The community seemed nice enough at first. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained common areas, and neighbors who waved when you drove past. What I did not anticipate was the iron-fisted rule of our HOA president, a woman named Patricia Vandermeer, who ran the association like it was her personal fiefdom. The violation notice stated that I had parked my vehicle in my driveway during the quarterly street maintenance ban on the night of March 15th. The fine was $500. $500 for parking in my own driveway during a ban I had completely forgotten about because I was too busy saving someone's life. I sat down at my kitchen table and read the letter 3 more times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. The language was cold and bureaucratic, listing the specific HOA covenant I had violated, the date and time of the infraction, and a grainy photograph of my Honda Civic sitting in my driveway at 11:47 p.m. There was no room for appeals, no consideration of extenuating circumstances. Just pay the fine within 30 days or face additional penalties, including a lien on my property. My hands were shaking as I set the letter down. March 15th. That was the night Mrs. Chen from 3 streets over had called me in a panic because her husband was having chest pains. I remembered everything about that night with perfect clarity, because it had been one of those situations where minutes mattered, where the difference between life and death came down to quick action and medical knowledge. I had been home for maybe 2 hours, finally relaxing after a brutal 12-hour shift when my phone rang. I was on the volunteer neighborhood medical response list, something I had signed up for precisely because I wanted to help my community. Mrs. Chen's voice had been high and terrified on the other end of the line. Her husband David was clutching his chest, sweating profusely, and saying he could not breathe. She did not know if she should call an ambulance or if she was overreacting. I had told her to call 911 immediately, and that I would be there in 2 minutes. I grabbed my emergency medical bag, the one I kept stocked with a portable AED, blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, and other essential supplies, and I ran out of my house without a second thought. My car was blocking the driveway entrance because I had been planning to go back out to get groceries, but I did not have time to move it. Every second counted when dealing with a potential cardiac event. When I arrived at the Chen residence, David was in bad shape. Classic signs of a heart attack: crushing chest pain radiating down his left arm, difficulty breathing, ashen complexion, diaphoresis. I immediately assessed his vitals while keeping him calm and still. His blood pressure was dangerously high, his pulse was rapid and irregular. I had Mrs. Chen get him an aspirin to chew while I prepared the AED, just in case. I stayed with them, monitoring his condition and providing emergency care until the paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. The paramedics confirmed my assessment. David Chen was having an acute myocardial infarction. They transported him to St. Mary's, where he underwent emergency catheterization and had 2 stents placed in blocked coronary arteries. The cardiologist on duty later told me that my quick response and proper initial care had likely prevented significant heart damage and possibly saved David's life. He was released from the hospital 5 days later and was expected to make a full recovery. And now, I was being fined $500 for parking in my own driveway during that emergency. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA management office. A bored-sounding receptionist answered after 4 rings. Meadowbrook Pines HOA, this is Jennifer speaking. Hi Jennifer, this is Harrison Keller from 1247 Willow Creek Drive. I just received a violation notice and I need to speak with someone about it. There were extenuating circumstances that night and I think this is a mistake. Hold please. The line went silent except for tinny elevator music. After 5 minutes, a new voice came on. This is Patricia Vandermeer, HOA president. What seems to be the problem, Mr. Keller? Patricia's voice was exactly what I expected. Sharp, clipped, and already annoyed. I had seen her around the neighborhood before. A woman in her late 40s with aggressively highlighted blonde hair styled in that particular cut that seemed to be the uniform of difficult suburban women everywhere. She drove a white Escalade with a "Live, Laugh, Love" bumper sticker and always wore enormous sunglasses even on cloudy days. Mrs. Vandermeer, I received a violation notice for parking in my driveway during the street maintenance ban on March 15th. I understand the rule, but that night I was responding to a medical emergency. One of our neighbors was having a heart attack and I am a cardiac nurse. I had to leave my house immediately to provide emergency care while waiting for the ambulance. There was a long pause. That's very unfortunate, but the rules are clear. All residents received notice of the maintenance ban 2 weeks in advance via email and a flyer placed on every door. No vehicles were to be parked in driveways or on streets between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. on March 15th. I understand that, but this was a life-threatening emergency. I was literally saving someone's life. Again, very unfortunate, but we cannot make exceptions. If we let one person violate the rules, then everyone will want exceptions. The maintenance crew needed clear access to all driveways for the work they were contracted to perform. Your vehicle obstructed that access. I felt my jaw clench. Mrs. Vandermeer, with all due respect, a man's life was at stake. I am a medical professional and I responded to an emergency. Surely the HOA can take that into consideration. The fine stands, Mr. Keller. You have 30 days to pay. Have a good day. She hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone in disbelief. I had just been dismissed like a child who had not done his homework. $500, because I chose to save a neighbor's life instead of worrying about where my car was parked. I spent the rest of the day fuming about it, but I had to get ready for my night shift at the hospital. I worked 3 12-hour shifts per week, usually overnight, which meant my sleep schedule was perpetually messed up and I was constantly tired. But I loved my job. There was something deeply satisfying about working in cardiac care, about being there for people during some of the scariest moments of their lives, about using my skills and knowledge to make a real difference. As I drove to St. Mary's that evening, I could not stop thinking about the HOA fine. It was not just the money, though $500 was not nothing on a nurse's salary. It was the principle of the thing. It was the callous dismissal of the circumstances, the rigid adherence to rules over common sense and human decency. My shift was busy, which helped distract me. We had 2 post-surgical patients recovering from bypass procedures, one elderly woman with congestive heart failure, and a middle-aged man who had come in via the emergency room with arrhythmia. I moved between patients, checking vitals, administering medications, adjusting IVs, and providing the constant monitoring that cardiac patients required. My colleagues were the usual mix of dedicated professionals, and we worked well together, communicating efficiently and watching out for each other during the long night hours. During my break around 3 a.m., I sat in the staff lounge with my friend and fellow nurse, Marcus Rivera. I told him about the HOA situation while we both nursed terrible coffee from the machine that should have been replaced years ago. "That's insane," Marcus said, shaking his head. "You were literally saving a guy's life and they are still hitting you with a fine, $500. And she would not even hear me out, just said rules are rules and hung up on me. Classic HOA power trip. My sister dealt with something similar at her place in Scottsdale. They fined her for having the wrong shade of beige on her shutters. Beige. Like there is some universal beige standard that everyone is supposed to know about. What did she do? Fought it. Went to the HOA board meeting, brought paint swatches, made her case. They still would not budge, so she ended up paying a smaller fine after threatening to get a lawyer involved. But it took months and was a huge headache. I sighed. I do not have months. They want payment in 30 days. You could try going to the next board meeting. At least put it on record that you disagree. Get some of your neighbors to back you up. The Chens would probably support you, right? That was a good point. I decided I would reach out to David and Mrs. Chen and see if they would be willing to attend the HOA meeting with me. Surely their testimony about what happened that night would carry some weight. The next day, after I got home from my shift and managed to get a few hours of sleep, I walked over to the Chen residence. It was a beautiful spring morning in Phoenix, the temperature still pleasant before the brutal summer heat set in. The neighborhood looked picture perfect, with manicured lawns and blooming desert landscaping. Every house in compliance with the strict HOA guidelines about exterior appearance. Mrs. Chen answered the door with a warm smile. She was a petite woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a bun. "Harrison, how wonderful to see you. Please come in." I stepped inside their home, which smelled like jasmine tea and something delicious baking. David was sitting in the living room, looking much healthier than the last time I had seen him. He stood up when I entered, moving carefully but steadily. "Harrison, my friend," David said, reaching out to shake my hand. "I have been meaning to come by and thank you properly. The doctors told us that your quick response that night saved my life. I am just glad I was home and could help. How are you feeling?" "Much better. Still taking it easy, following all the doctor's orders. No more late-night steaks and cigars for me," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Please sit down. Can we get you some tea? Something to eat?" We sat down and Mrs. Chen brought out a tray with tea and homemade almond cookies. After we exchanged pleasantries and I asked more detailed questions about David's recovery and medication regimen, I told them about the HOA fine. Both of their faces darkened as I explained the situation. "That is outrageous," David said, his voice rising. "You saved my life and they are punishing you for it." I tried to explain the circumstances to Patricia Vandermeer, but she would not budge. She said rules are rules and no exceptions can be made. I am planning to attend the next HOA board meeting to contest the fine formally, and I was wondering if you two would be willing to come with me and explain what happened that night. "Of course," Mrs. Chen said immediately. "Absolutely, we will be there. This is wrong, completely wrong." "We will do whatever you need," David added. "Write letters, speak at the meeting, whatever it takes. You should not be penalized for helping someone." I felt a wave of relief. At least I would not be facing the HOA alone. We talked for a while longer, and David told me more about his hospital stay and the cardiologist's recommendations. He was on a new medication regimen and had started cardiac rehabilitation. He was determined to take better care of himself going forward, and I was glad to see how seriously he was taking his recovery. When I got home, I checked the HOA website for information about the next board meeting. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. According to the website, residents could submit items for discussion by emailing the board president 72 hours in advance. I drafted a professional email to Patricia Vandermeer, outlining my situation and requesting time to address the board about my violation notice. I kept it factual and unemotional, simply stating the facts of what happened on March 15th and why I believed the fine should be waived. Patricia responded 2 hours later with a terse email confirming that I would have 5 minutes to address the board during the resident concerns portion of the meeting. 5 minutes. To explain why saving someone's life should matter more than a parking rule. I spent the next few days preparing what I would say. I gathered documentation, a copy of my nursing license, a letter from the hospital confirming my employment and specialty, a timeline of the events of March 15th, and a statement from David Chen's cardiologist about the seriousness of his condition and the importance of immediate intervention in cardiac emergencies. I wanted to be thorough and professional, to show the board that this was not about trying to get out of a fine, but about acknowledging that sometimes rigid rules needed to accommodate extraordinary circumstances. Tuesday evening arrived, and I put on business casual attire, wanting to make a good impression. I picked up David and Mrs. Chen, who were both dressed nicely and carrying a folder of their own documents. We drove to the Meadowbrook Pines Clubhouse, a sprawling building near the community entrance that featured a gym, pool, and meeting rooms. The board meeting room was set up like a small courtroom, with a long table at the front where the 5 board members sat, and rows of chairs for residents. About 20 people were already seated when we arrived. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood, though I did not know most of them by name. We took seats in the 3rd row and waited. Patricia Vandermeer sat in the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members whose names I learned from the nameplates in front of them. Robert Brennan, the vice president, Susan Lawton, the secretary, Michael Torres, the treasurer, and Barbara Finch, a member at large. Patricia was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, and her signature oversized sunglasses were perched on top of her head. She had a stack of papers in front of her and a gavel, which seemed unnecessarily dramatic for an HOA meeting. Patricia called the meeting to order at precisely 7 p.m., banging the gavel twice. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the April meeting of the Meadowbrook Pines Homeowners Association Board. We have a full agenda tonight, so let us begin. The first 45 minutes were devoted to mundane HOA business. Approval of the previous meeting's minutes, a financial report from the treasurer showing healthy reserves, discussion of landscaping contracts for the common areas, and a lengthy debate about whether to install new playground equipment at the community park. I tried to pay attention, but my mind kept drifting to what I would say when it was my turn. Finally, Patricia announced, "We will now move to resident concerns. We have one item on the agenda tonight. Harrison Keller has requested time to address the board regarding a violation notice. Mr. Keller, you have 5 minutes. Please come forward." I stood up, my heart pounding. I walked to the front of the room where a small podium had been set up for speakers. David and Mrs. Chen gave me encouraging nods as I passed their row. "Good evening, board members. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. My name is Harrison Keller, and I live at 1247 Willow Creek Drive. I'm here to contest a $500 fine I received for parking in my driveway during the street maintenance ban on March 15th. I paused and looked at each board member in turn. Patricia's expression was stony and unreadable. The others looked mildly interested but non-committal. I want to be clear that I understand the HOA rules, and I respect the need for community standards. However, on the night of March 15th, I was responding to a medical emergency that required immediate action. I am a registered cardiac care nurse at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, and I have been a medical professional for 8 years. I held up my nursing license and hospital ID badge. That night, I received a phone call from a neighbor who lives on Maple Ridge Court. Her husband was experiencing symptoms of a heart attack, severe chest pain, difficulty breathing, and radiating arm pain. She was terrified and did not know what to do. As a medical professional and a member of our neighborhood medical response network, I immediately grabbed my emergency medical equipment and drove to their home. I showed them the timeline I had prepared. The call came in at 11:38 p.m. I was at their home by 11:41 p.m. When I arrived, I assessed the patient and confirmed that he was indeed experiencing an acute myocardial infarction, what most people call a heart attack. I provided emergency care, including vital sign monitoring and aspirin administration, while we waited for the ambulance to arrive. The paramedics transported him to St. Mary's, where he underwent emergency cardiac catheterization and had 2 stents placed in blocked arteries. I held up the letter from the cardiologist. According to the attending cardiologist, the patient's condition was critical, and the rapid medical response likely prevented significant cardiac damage and possibly death. In other words, those few minutes mattered. If I had taken the time to move my car from the driveway before responding to the emergency, those precious minutes could have made the difference between life and death. Patricia held up a hand. Mr. Keller, we are all very glad that your neighbor is okay, but this does not change the fact that you violated HOA rules. All residents were notified of the parking ban well in advance. I understand that, Mrs. Vandermeer. But surely the HOA has some mechanism for considering extenuating circumstances. This was not a matter of me forgetting about the rule or choosing to ignore it. This was a genuine medical emergency where a human life was at stake. Rules exist for a reason, Patricia said. The maintenance crew was contracted to perform necessary work that required clear access to all driveways. Your vehicle obstructed that access. Did the maintenance crew report any actual problems caused by my car, any delays or inability to complete their work? There was a brief silence. Patricia flipped through some papers. That's not the point. The rule clearly states, with respect, I think it is the point. If my car did not actually prevent the crew from doing their job, and if I was engaged in saving someone's life, then I believe the spirit of the rule should be considered, not just the letter of it. David Chen stood up from his seat. Excuse me, may I say something? Patricia looked annoyed but nodded. You have 2 minutes. David came forward and I stepped aside to let him speak. His voice was strong and clear. My name is David Chen and I live at 842 Maple Ridge Court. I am the neighbor Harrison is talking about. On March 15th, I would have died without his help. It is that simple. My heart was failing and he responded within minutes to provide life-saving care. He did not think about parking rules or HOA regulations. He thought about helping another human being in crisis. I am standing here today because of him. My wife still has a husband, my grandchildren still have a grandfather, all because Harrison Keller put another person's life ahead of rules and regulations. Mrs. Chen also stood. I am David's wife, Susan Chen. I made that phone call that night. I was terrified that I was losing my husband. Harrison came immediately. He was professional, calm, and competent. He saved David's life, and now you want to fine him $500 for parking in his own driveway while he did that. That is not just wrong, it is immoral." The room was silent. A few other residents were nodding in agreement. I noticed several people were looking at Patricia with expressions that suggested they shared the Chen's view. Patricia cleared her throat. "We appreciate your testimony, Mr. and Mrs. Chen. However, the board must consider the precedent we set. If we waive fines for one person, others will expect the same treatment." "This is not just any situation," I said, stepping back to the podium. "This is a documented medical emergency. I have provided evidence of my professional qualifications, the seriousness of the emergency, and the outcome. I am not asking for the HOA to eliminate rules or to allow random exceptions. I am asking for recognition that extraordinary circumstances sometimes require flexibility." Robert Brennan, the vice president, spoke up for the first time. "Patricia, I think Mr. Keller makes a valid point. Maybe we should consider reducing or waiving the fine given the circumstances." Patricia shot him a look that could have frozen water. "Robert, we have discussed this. Rules must be enforced uniformly." "But we have waived fines before," another board member, Michael Torres, said. "Remember when the Martinez family had that tree fall on their roof during the storm? We waived their fine for not trimming it because it was an act of God." "That was completely different," Patricia snapped. "How?" I asked. "How is an act of God more worthy of consideration than an act of saving a human life?" Patricia's face was reddening. "Mr. Keller, your 5 minutes are up. The board will take your concerns under consideration and vote on whether to uphold or waive the fine. You will be notified of our decision within 10 business days. When will you vote? That will be discussed in executive session." "An executive session? Why does this need to be discussed in private? This seems like something the community should hear." Patricia banged her gavel. "This portion of the meeting is closed. Please return to your seat." I wanted to argue further, but I could see it was pointless. I returned to my seat next to the Chens, frustrated but hoping that the other board members might see reason even if Patricia did not. The rest of the meeting dragged on with discussions about pool hours and a proposal to add speed bumps on one of the through streets. Finally, at 8:30, Patricia adjourned the public session and announced that the board would retire to executive session. As residents filed out, several people approached me to offer support. An older gentleman named Frank who lived on my street shook my hand and said he thought the whole thing was ridiculous. A younger woman with 2 kids said she was grateful there were people like me in the neighborhood. It was encouraging, but I knew the decision ultimately rested with the board. David and Mrs. Chen were both upset on my behalf. "That woman is something else," David said as we walked to the parking lot. "The way she dismissed everything, like your actions meant nothing." "She has always been like this," Mrs. Chen added. "Last year she tried to fine the Johnsons because their son's basketball hoop was 6 inches over the property line. 6 inches. They had to hire a surveyor to prove it was actually in compliance." I drove them home and thanked them profusely for their support. When I got back to my own house, I felt drained. The whole experience had been frustrating and demoralizing. I did not have a good feeling about how the vote would go. 10 business days came and went without any communication from the HOA. On the 11th business day, I called the management office. Jennifer, the receptionist, put me on hold for several minutes before coming back. "Mr. Keller, I am showing that a decision letter was sent to your address 3 days ago. I have not received anything. Let me check with Mrs. Vandermeer." More hold music. Patricia came on the line. "Mr. Keller, the board voted to uphold the fine. The decision letter was mailed to you on Friday." My heart sank. The board upheld it, even after everything that was presented at the meeting. The vote was 3-2. The majority felt that waiving the fine would set a bad precedent. Your payment is now overdue. If we do not receive the $500 within the next week, additional late fees will be assessed, and we will proceed with placing a lien on your property. You cannot be serious. A lien on my property for parking in my driveway during a medical emergency. Those are the consequences outlined in the HOA covenants that you agreed to when you purchased your home. I suggest you pay promptly to avoid further penalties. She hung up. I stood in my kitchen, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles were white. This was beyond unreasonable. It was vindictive. I thought about just paying the fine to make the problem go away, but something in me rebelled against the injustice of it. I was being punished for doing the right thing, for using my professional skills to help someone in need. I decided to call a lawyer. I found a local attorney named Rachel Morrison who specialized in HOA disputes. Her website said she offered free initial consultations, so I made an appointment for the following week. Rachel's office was in a modest building in downtown Phoenix. She was a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I told her the entire story, showing her all my documentation. She listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen on her desk. This is an interesting case. HOAs have a lot of power, and courts generally defer to their enforcement of covenants and rules. However, there are limits. The key question is whether the HOA acted reasonably and in good faith. They did not even try to be reasonable, I said. They completely dismissed the emergency circumstances. That works in your favor. The fact that you can document the medical emergency, that you have testimony from the people you helped, and that the HOA refused to even consider the circumstances suggests they may have acted arbitrarily. Arizona law requires HOAs to act in good faith and not enforce rules in a way that is arbitrary or capricious. So I have a case, possibly. I would need to review your HOA's governing documents, see exactly what the covenants say about fines and enforcement, and research some case law. But based on what you have told me, I think we could make a strong argument that the fine should be waived or significantly reduced. The challenge is that litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Even if you win, you might spend more in legal fees than the fine itself. That was the catch. I did not have thousands of dollars lying around to pay lawyers for an extended legal battle, even if I was in the right. Is there any other option? I asked. You could try requesting mediation. Many HOA disputes can be resolved through mediation before they get to court. It is less expensive and less adversarial. If the HOA agrees to it, you would sit down with a neutral third party and try to reach a compromise. Would Patricia Vandermeer agree to that? Rachel smiled slightly. In my experience, HOA board presidents like the one you have described often do not want to mediate because they are used to getting their way. But if you formally request it and they refuse, that can also work in your favor if the case does end up in court. It shows you made good faith efforts to resolve the dispute reasonably. I decided to go that route. Rachel helped me draft a formal letter to the HOA board requesting mediation of the dispute. The letter outlined the facts of the case, cited the relevant Arizona statutes about good faith enforcement of HOA rules, and proposed mediation as a cost-effective way to resolve the matter. We sent it certified mail to ensure there was a record of receipt. The response came a week later. Patricia Vandermeer had written a brief letter on behalf of the board, denying the request for mediation. The letter stated that the board's decision was final and that I had until the end of the month to pay the fine plus late fees, which now totaled $575, or face a lien on my property. I showed the letter to Rachel. She shook her head. They are really digging in. At this point, you have a few options. You can pay the fine under protest and then sue for reimbursement. You can refuse to pay and let them place the lien, then challenge the lien in court. Or you can file a lawsuit now seeking an injunction to prevent them from collecting the fine. None of those options were appealing. All of them meant spending money I did not have and entering into a protracted legal fight. But I was also angry now. This was not just about me anymore. It was about Patricia Vandermeer and her board abusing their power and punishing someone for doing the right thing. Let us file the lawsuit, I said. I am not going to let them get away with this. Rachel nodded. Okay, I will prepare a complaint. This is going to take some time and it is going to cost money. I will try to keep my fees reasonable, but you need to be prepared for this to be expensive. She quoted me a retainer fee of $3,000. It hurt to write that check, but I did it. Rachel filed the lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court, alleging that the HOA had violated its duty to act in good faith and had enforced its rules in an arbitrary and capricious manner. We sought an order waiving the fine and awarding me attorney's fees and costs. The lawsuit was filed in early May. The HOA had to be formally served with the complaint, and then they had a certain amount of time to respond. Rachel warned me that the legal process moved slowly and that it could be months before we saw any resolution. In the meantime, life went on. I continued working my shifts at the hospital, continued living in my house under the constant awareness that the HOA was trying to place a lien on my property. The atmosphere in the neighborhood became noticeably tense. Word spread quickly about the lawsuit. Some neighbors were supportive, stopping me on the street to tell me they thought I was doing the right thing. Others seemed to avoid me, perhaps worried about getting on Patricia Vandermeer's bad side or just preferring to stay out of neighborhood drama. David Chen was recovering well and had returned to his normal activities with appropriate modifications. He and Mrs. Chen remained staunchly supportive, and David even wrote a detailed letter that Rachel included in our court filings, describing the events of that night and emphasizing that my quick response had saved his life. In mid-June, the HOA filed its response to the lawsuit. Their attorney argued that the HOA had absolute authority to enforce its covenants and rules, that I had been properly notified of the parking ban, and that I had violated the rule regardless of the reason. They claimed that allowing me to avoid the fine would undermine the entire structure of HOA governance and create chaos where anyone could claim an emergency to get out of violations. Rachel and I met to discuss the HOA's response. Their argument is typical but not very strong, she said. They are trying to make this about whether HOAs can enforce rules at all, which is not what this case is about. We are not saying they cannot enforce parking rules. We are saying they acted unreasonably when they refused to consider documented emergency circumstances. That is a very different argument. What happens now? Now we go through discovery. Both sides can request documents and information from each other. We can depose board members, ask them questions under oath. I want to depose Patricia Vandermeer in particular. I want to understand her decision-making process and whether she considered the emergency circumstances at all. Discovery turned out to be revealing. Through document requests, we obtained copies of all the HOA board's emails and meeting minutes related to my case. What we found was disturbing. In the emails leading up to the board vote on my fine, Patricia Vandermeer had made several comments that suggested personal animus rather than objective enforcement. In one email to another board member, she had written, "Harrison Keller thinks he is special because he is a nurse. He needs to learn that rules apply to everyone, even people with fancy medical degrees." In another email, she complained that I was causing trouble by contesting the fine, and said the board needed to make an example of me to discourage other residents from challenging HOA decisions. Rachel was delighted when she saw these emails. This is exactly what we need. She is admitting in writing that her motivation was not about uniform enforcement of rules. It was about putting you in your place and deterring challenges to her authority. That is textbook arbitrary and capricious behavior. The deposition of Patricia Vandermeer took place in July at Rachel's office. Patricia showed up with the HOA's attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Gregory Hartman. Patricia was wearing a bright yellow dress and her enormous sunglasses, which she kept on indoors even though we were in a windowless conference room. Rachel conducted the deposition with surgical precision. She started with basic questions about Patricia's role on the board and her understanding of HOA rules and enforcement procedures. Then she moved to the specific facts of my case. "Mrs. Vandermeer, when Mr. Keller called you to explain that he had been responding to a medical emergency, what was your reaction?" Patricia shifted in her seat. "I told him that rules are rules and that we could not make exceptions." "Did you ask him for any details about the nature of the emergency?" "No." "Did you ask whether anyone had been injured or whether lives had been at stake?" "No. It was not relevant, not relevant." "How can you say that the reason someone violated a parking rule was not relevant to deciding whether to enforce a fine?" Patricia's attorney interjected. "Objection. Argumentative." Rachel did not back down. "Mrs. Vandermeer, did you review any of the documentation Mr. Keller provided before the board meeting? The letter from the cardiologist, the timeline of events, his nursing credentials?" "I may have glanced at them." "You may have glanced at them. Did you read them thoroughly?" "I did not need to." The rule was clear. "Did you consult with the maintenance crew to ask if Mr. Keller's vehicle had actually caused any problems or delays in their work?" Patricia hesitated. "No." "So you did not verify whether there was any actual harm caused by Mr. Keller's violation?" "The rule does not require actual harm. The rule says no parking during the ban period." "Mrs. Vandermeer, I am going to show you an email you sent to board member Robert Brennan on March 20th. Rachel slid a printed copy across the table. "This is your email, correct?" Patricia squinted at it. "Yes." "Can you read the highlighted portion aloud?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "Harrison Keller thinks he is special because he is a nurse. He needs to learn that rules apply to everyone, even people with fancy medical degrees." "What did you mean by that statement?" "Just that he was not above the rules. It sounds like you had a personal negative view of Mr. Keller because of his profession. Is that fair to say?" "No, I just meant that everyone has to follow the same rules." Rachel pulled out another document. "And this email from March 23rd, where you wrote that Mr. Keller was causing trouble and that the board needed to make an example of him. What did you mean by making an example of him?" "Just that we needed to enforce the rules consistently." "Or did you mean that you wanted to punish him for challenging your authority?" "Objection." Gregory Hartman stood up. "This is harassment." "It is a legitimate question based on her own written statements," Rachel said calmly. The deposition continued for 2 more hours. By the end, Patricia looked rattled and angry. Her attorney had objected numerous times, but Rachel had gotten what she needed. Clear evidence that Patricia's decision to uphold the fine had been motivated by personal animosity and a desire to assert control rather than any legitimate HOA interest. Rachel also deposed the other board members, Robert Brennan and Michael Torres, the two who had voted against upholding the fine. Both testified that they had thought the emergency circumstances warranted waiving the fine, but that Patricia had pressured them during the executive session to maintain a united front. Susan Lawton and Barbara Finch, who had voted with Patricia, gave vague testimony about the importance of uniform rule enforcement, but admitted they had not really examined the evidence I had presented. As summer wore on, the legal battle intensified. The HOA filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the case should be dismissed because they had the legal authority to enforce the fine regardless of the circumstances. Rachel filed a cross motion for summary judgment, arguing that the evidence clearly showed the HOA had acted in bad faith and that I was entitled to prevail as a matter of law. In September, we had a hearing before Judge Marilyn Castillo. Both attorneys presented their arguments. Gregory Hartman focused on the HOA's broad authority to enforce covenants and argued that courts should not second-guess board decisions. Rachel focused on the specific facts of the case: the documented emergency, the evidence that the HOA president had been motivated by personal animus, and the failure to consider whether any actual harm had occurred. Judge Castillo was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who asked pointed questions of both attorneys. She seemed particularly interested in the emails Patricia had sent. "Mr. Hartman, how do you explain these emails where your client states she wants to make an example of Mr. Keller? That does not sound like objective enforcement of rules to me." "Your Honor, Mrs. Vandermeer may have chosen her words poorly, but her intent was simply to ensure consistent enforcement. It reads more like she had a personal grudge." "And what about the fact that the board did not even inquire whether the maintenance crew had been affected by Mr. Keller's vehicle? That seems like a pretty basic question if the purpose of the rule was to ensure the crew could do their work." "The rule does not require proof of actual harm, Your Honor." "Perhaps not, but it is certainly relevant to whether enforcing the fine was reasonable under the circumstances." The hearing lasted 90 minutes. At the end, Judge Castillo said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 30 days. Those 30 days were agonizing. I tried to focus on work and not obsess over the case, but it was hard not to constantly wonder how the judge would rule. I had invested so much time, money, and emotional energy into fighting this injustice. If I lost, I would not only have to pay the fine but probably the HOA's attorney fees as well, which could be substantial. The ruling came on a Wednesday afternoon. Rachel called me at home and I could hear the smile in her voice before she even spoke. We won. I felt a wave of relief so intense I had to sit down. We won. Completely. Judge Castillo granted our motion for summary judgment and denied the HOA's. She wrote a very detailed opinion. I am emailing it to you now, but the bottom line is she found that the HOA acted arbitrarily and capriciously in enforcing the fine. She specifically cited the emails showing personal animus, the failure to investigate whether any actual harm occurred, and the refusal to consider the documented emergency circumstances. The fine is vacated, and the judge ordered the HOA to pay our attorney fees and costs. They have to pay our legal fees. Yes. The judge found that their conduct was so unreasonable that you are entitled to recover what you spent defending yourself. It is not a complete recovery, but it will offset a significant portion of your costs. I was almost speechless. After months of fighting, I had actually won. The judge had seen through Patricia Vandermeer's power trip and vindicated my position. I thanked Rachel profusely. She had done an incredible job, and I could not have asked for better representation. The judge's written opinion was 23 pages long and methodically dismantled every argument the HOA had made. She wrote, "While homeowners associations have legitimate authority to enforce covenants and rules, that authority is not unlimited. HOAs must act reasonably and in good faith." When an HOA president admits in writing that she wants to make an example of a homeowner, and when the board fails to undertake even basic inquiry into whether emergency circumstances warrant consideration, the association has crossed the line from reasonable enforcement to arbitrary punishment. The judge also noted, Mr. Keller was engaged in providing emergency medical care that, by all accounts, saved a neighbor's life. To punish him for this with a $500 fine, without any consideration of the circumstances, is not just unreasonable, it is unconscionable. The opinion was scathing in its criticism of Patricia Vandermeer's conduct, and made clear that the judge viewed her actions as an abuse of power. The HOA had 30 days to appeal. Gregory Hartman sent Rachel a terse email stating that they were evaluating their options. I hoped they would just accept the ruling and move on, but I would not have been surprised if Patricia's ego drove her to appeal. Meanwhile, word of the court decision spread through Meadowbrook Pines like wildfire. I received calls, texts, and emails from numerous neighbors congratulating me. David and Mrs. Chen brought over a homemade cake to celebrate. Even people I barely knew stopped me on the street to say they were glad I had won, but not everyone was happy. Patricia Vandermeer's supporters, a small but vocal group, complained that the lawsuit had undermined the HOA's authority and that the neighborhood would descend into chaos now that people knew they could challenge fines. There were several heated exchanges on the neighborhood Facebook page, with some people defending the court's decision and others insisting that rules needed to be enforced without exceptions. One evening in early October, about a week after the court decision, I came home from a shift at the hospital to find a note taped to my front door. It was handwritten on HOA letterhead and signed by Patricia Vandermeer. "Mr. Keller, this is not over. The board will be reviewing all aspects of your property for compliance with HOA covenants. Any violations will be cited and fined. You may have won this battle, but you will not win the war." The note was childish and vindictive, and it was also deeply concerning. Patricia was clearly threatening to harass me with retaliatory enforcement actions. I immediately photographed the note and sent it to Rachel. She called me back within the hour. "This is incredibly stupid on her part. Retaliatory enforcement is illegal in Arizona. If she starts targeting you with fines for minor violations while ignoring the same violations on other properties, we can go back to court and get an injunction against the HOA, and we can seek additional damages. So what should I do? Document everything. Take photos of your property and neighboring properties. If they cite you for anything, make sure you can show that other residents are doing the same thing without being fined. Keep the note. It is evidence of her retaliatory intent." Over the next several weeks, I did exactly that. I took extensive photos of my property and walked the neighborhood documenting what other residents had. Lawn decorations, mailboxes, house numbers, landscaping features, everything that might potentially be subject to HOA rules. I wanted to be prepared if Patricia tried to follow through on her threat. In late October, the HOA did indeed send me a violation notice. This one claimed that my front yard landscaping included non-compliant desert vegetation, and that I needed to remove 2 barrel cacti and replace them with approved plants from the HOA's landscaping guidelines. The fine for non-compliance was $250. The problem with this citation was that barrel cacti were all over the neighborhood. At least a dozen other houses had them in their front yards, some much larger and more prominent than mine. I took photos of every single one, carefully noting the addresses. I also pulled up the HOA's landscaping guidelines and discovered that barrel cacti were not actually on the prohibited plant list. In fact, they were specifically mentioned as examples of appropriate native desert landscaping in the guidelines that had been in effect when I bought my house. The guidelines had been updated recently, but Arizona law required HOAs to give homeowners reasonable time to come into compliance with new landscaping rules, typically at least a year. Rachel had a field day with this when I showed her the violation notice and my documentation. This is perfect evidence of retaliatory enforcement. She is citing you for something that is not actually a violation under the applicable rules, and she is ignoring the same supposed violation on numerous other properties. We need to go back to court. We filed a motion for injunctive relief and for sanctions against Patricia Vandermeer personally. Rachel argued that Patricia was engaging in a pattern of harassment and retaliation, that she was abusing her position on the HOA board, and that she needed to be held accountable. The hearing was scheduled for mid-November. This time, in addition to the usual cast of characters, several of my neighbors attended to support me. David and Mrs. Chen were there, of course, but so were Frank from down the street, a woman named Melissa who lived around the corner, and Tom and Jennifer Patel who lived 2 doors down from me. They all wanted to witness Patricia being held accountable. Judge Castillo clearly remembered the case. When Gregory Hartman stood up to argue that the new violation notice was legitimate, she cut him off. "Mr. Hartman, I have reviewed the briefing and frankly, I am appalled. Your client learned nothing from my previous ruling. She is clearly engaging in retaliatory enforcement against Mr. Keller, and the evidence he has presented is overwhelming. Not only are there numerous other properties with the same landscaping, but the plants in question are not even prohibited under the applicable guidelines. Your Honor, the board has discretion to interpret the guidelines. Discretion is not the same as arbitrary targeting. And I have here a note that Mrs. Vandermeer personally left on Mr. Keller's door stating that this was not over and that she would be reviewing his property for violations. That is textbook retaliation." The judge turned to Patricia, who was sitting at the defense table looking defiant. "Mrs. Vandermeer, you understand that you are subject to court orders. You understand that retaliatory enforcement is illegal." Patricia stood up, despite her attorney trying to pull her back down. "Your Honor, I am just trying to do my job as HOA president. Mr. Keller has been a troublemaker since the day he moved in, and he is trying to undermine the authority of the board." Mrs. Vandermeer, "Mr. Keller saved a man's life. That is not being a troublemaker. That is being a good neighbor and a medical professional doing his duty. The fact that you cannot see the difference is deeply troubling. Rules are rules, and the law is the law," Judge Castillo interrupted. "And the law says you cannot use your position to harass residents who have successfully challenged improper HOA actions. I am granting Mr. Keller's motion for an injunction. The violation notice regarding his landscaping is vacated. Furthermore, Mrs. Vandermeer, you are personally enjoined from initiating any enforcement actions against Mr. Keller's property for the next 12 months. Any violations must be reviewed and approved by a majority of the other board members, and Mr. Keller must be given an opportunity to demonstrate that other properties have the same alleged violation without being cited." "Your Honor, that is outrageous. What is outrageous is your conduct, Mrs. Vandermeer. I am also granting Mr. Keller's request for sanctions. You are personally liable for his attorney fees and costs related to this second motion. And I am warning you that if you continue this pattern of behavior, I will hold you in contempt of court." The courtroom was silent. Patricia looked like she had been slapped. Her attorney was furiously scribbling notes, probably already thinking about an appeal. Judge Castillo was not done. "I am also going to order something unusual here. I am directing the HOA to hold a special meeting where residents can vote on whether to recall Mrs. Vandermeer from the board. Based on what I have seen, her continued leadership is detrimental to this community." Gregory Hartman shot to his feet. "Your Honor, the court cannot interfere with internal HOA governance. I can when a board member's conduct has been the subject of repeated litigation and has been found to be retaliatory and abusive. The HOA's governing documents surely have provisions for recall of board members. Those provisions will be followed. This order simply requires that a vote be scheduled within 60 days. The judge banged her gavel. "We are adjourned." As we filed out of the courtroom, I was surrounded by my neighbors congratulating me. David was beaming. "That judge really let her have it," he said. "She deserved every word," Mrs. Chen added. Rachel pulled me aside. "That went even better than I hoped. Not only did we get the injunction, but the judge essentially ordered a recall election." "That is very unusual, but Patricia's conduct was so egregious that the judge felt it was necessary to protect the community." "What are the chances she will actually be recalled?" "I think they are pretty good. A lot of residents are unhappy with her, and now they have a clear path to removing her." "You should talk to your neighbors, encourage people to vote." The HOA was required to send notice of the special recall election to all residents within 2 weeks. The notice went out in early December, announcing that a vote would be held on January 10th to determine whether Patricia Vandermeer should be removed as HOA president and from the board entirely. The campaign leading up to the vote was intense. Patricia and her supporters distributed flyers defending her leadership and claiming that she was being unfairly targeted for enforcing rules. They portrayed me as a troublemaker who wanted to destroy the HOA and let the neighborhood fall into disrepair. My supporters, who were far more numerous, distributed their own flyers and organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss Patricia's conduct. David Chen spoke passionately about how Patricia had tried to punish me for saving his life. Other residents shared their own stories of what they viewed as unreasonable enforcement actions, and Patricia's general attitude of being on a power trip. One woman, a single mother named Lisa who lived on Birch Street, told a story about how Patricia had fined her for leaving her trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. Lisa worked 2 jobs and sometimes did not get home until late. She had explained this to Patricia and asked for some flexibility, but Patricia had refused and assessed a fine. The fine had been a real financial hardship for Lisa, who was barely making ends meet. Another resident, an elderly man named Walter, described how Patricia had tried to fine him for having a medical ramp installed at his front entrance without prior HOA approval. Walter was recovering from a stroke and needed the ramp to get in and out of his house safely. He had gone through the proper permitting process with the city, but Patricia claimed he should have gotten HOA approval first, even though his health needs were urgent. These stories painted a picture of a petty tyrant who cared more about control than about the well-being of the community. By the time the election rolled around in January, sentiment had clearly turned against Patricia. The vote was conducted by mail-in ballot to ensure maximum participation. Residents had 2 weeks to return their ballots. The results would be counted at a special board meeting on January 10th. I attended that meeting along with what seemed like half the neighborhood. The community clubhouse was packed, with people standing along the walls because all the seats were filled. Patricia sat at the board table looking grim, her arms crossed and her expression defiant. Robert Brennan, as vice president, conducted the meeting. He announced that 487 ballots had been returned out of 612 eligible voters, a turnout of almost 80%. He opened the sealed box containing the ballots and began counting with the other board members, excluding Patricia, who was not allowed to participate in counting votes for her own recall. The counting took about 30 minutes. When Robert finally looked up, his expression was neutral but his voice was clear. The results of the recall vote are as follows: 412 votes in favor of recall, 73 votes against recall, 2 ballots spoiled due to improper marking. Patricia Vandermeer is hereby removed from the position of HOA president and from the board of directors, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Patricia sat frozen for a moment, then stood up and walked out without a word. Her few supporters followed her, but the vast majority of residents remained, celebrating what felt like a victory for common sense and community over petty authoritarianism. Robert Brennan called the meeting back to order. We will need to hold elections for a new president and board member to fill the vacancy. In the interim, I will serve as acting president. I want to assure everyone that the board is committed to enforcing our covenants and rules fairly and reasonably. We will not tolerate retaliation or abuse of authority. After the meeting, I was surrounded by neighbors thanking me for standing up to Patricia. Many people said they had been intimidated by her for years, but had not had the courage to challenge her. My lawsuit had given them the opportunity to finally remove her from power. David Chen shook my hand warmly. You did not just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us. This neighborhood is going to be a better place now. In the weeks that followed, life in Meadowbrook Pines did become noticeably better. The HOA held elections for Patricia's replacement, and a reasonable, level-headed woman named Catherine Reeves was elected. Catherine was a retired teacher who believed in rules, but also in common sense and compassion. One of her first acts as a board member was to propose amendments to the HOA's enforcement procedures, to include a formal appeal process and requirements for the board to consider extenuating circumstances before assessing fines for first-time violations. The residents voted overwhelmingly to approve these changes. The new procedures meant that situations like mine would be handled much more fairly in the future. I also settled the attorney fees issue with the HOA. Under the court's orders, they owed me a substantial amount for both the initial lawsuit and the retaliation case. The total came to just over $11,000. Between that recovery and the satisfaction of knowing I had stood up for what was right, I felt that the entire ordeal had been worth it. Patricia Vandermeer moved out of Meadowbrook Pines in March. Rumor had it that she and her husband bought a house in a different development across town, hopefully one where she would not have any HOA authority. I did not wish her ill, but I was relieved to know I would not have to deal with her anymore. Life settled into a comfortable routine. I continued my work at St. Mary's, continued to be on call for neighborhood medical emergencies, and enjoyed living in a community that now felt genuinely supportive rather than oppressively rule-bound. David Chen made a full recovery from his heart attack and became an advocate for cardiac health awareness, organizing a CPR training class for residents through the HOA. I volunteered to help teach it, and we had an excellent turnout. One evening in late April, about a year after the whole saga began, I was sitting on my front porch enjoying the pleasant spring weather when Frank from down the street walked by with his dog. "Hey, Harrison. How is it going?" "Pretty good, Frank. How about you?" "Cannot complain." "You know, I was just thinking about everything that happened last year. That whole mess with Patricia and the parking fine. Hard to forget. It is funny how things work out. If she had just been reasonable from the start, if she had just said, okay, given the circumstances, we will waive the fine, none of the rest of it would have happened. She would still be HOA president. The community would not have gone through all that drama, and she would not have been publicly humiliated and forced to move." I nodded. "That is the thing about power. Some people cannot resist abusing it, even when it is clearly the wrong thing to do. And eventually that catches up with them. Well, I am glad you stood up to her. A lot of us were too scared or too tired to fight. You did the whole neighborhood a favor. I was just trying to do the right thing. I could not accept being punished for helping someone." "That is what makes you a good person, Harrison, and a good neighbor." Frank and his dog continued their walk, and I sat there thinking about everything that had happened. It had been exhausting and expensive and stressful, but in the end, justice had prevailed. The HOA was now being run by reasonable people who understood that rules existed to serve the community, not the other way around. Patricia's reign of petty tyranny was over. And I had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself and for what is right, even when it is difficult, can make a real difference. I thought about that night a year ago when Mrs. Chen had called in a panic about her husband. I thought about grabbing my medical bag and running out the door without a second thought about where my car was parked. I thought about those critical minutes when David's life hung in the balance and how my training and quick action had saved him. That was what mattered. That was what being a nurse and a decent human being was all about. Not HOA rules about parking during maintenance bans, but being there for people when they needed help the most. The sun was setting over the Phoenix skyline, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I could hear children playing in a yard down the street, the sound of laughter and joy. This was what a community should be. People looking out for each other, supporting each other, treating each other with decency and respect. I finished my glass of iced tea and went inside, feeling grateful for the outcome and for the good people who had supported me throughout the ordeal. Tomorrow, I would go back to work at St. Mary's, back to caring for cardiac patients, back to using my skills to help people in their most vulnerable moments. And I would continue to live in Meadowbrook Pines, in a neighborhood that had learned some hard but important lessons about fairness, compassion, and the proper limits of authority. The whole experience had reinforced my belief that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was costly and difficult. I had not set out to become an HOA reform crusader. I had just wanted to help a neighbor in crisis without being punished for it. But sometimes standing up for a simple principle of fairness could have ripple effects that went far beyond your own situation. The changes that had been made to the HOA's enforcement procedures would benefit future residents for years to come. The removal of Patricia Vandermeer meant that the community would be governed more fairly and reasonably going forward. As I got ready for bed that night, I reflected on how much had changed in a year. From that initial shock of receiving an unjust fine, through months of legal battles and neighborhood drama, to the final vindication in court and the community coming together to vote out a bad leader. It had been quite a journey, one I never expected to take when I bought my house in this quiet Phoenix suburb. But I had learned something important. Communities work best when people are willing to stand up for what is right, when they refuse to accept injustice even when it would be easier to just pay the fine and move on, when they believe that fairness and common sense should prevail over rigid adherence to rules for rules' sake. The next morning, I went to work as usual. During my shift, one of my patients, an older gentleman recovering from a stent placement, asked me about the neighborhood I lived in. I told him it was a great community with good people, and I meant it. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, Meadowbrook Pines had become a place I was proud to call home. Not because it was perfect, but because when things went wrong, the community had come together to fix them. That was all anyone could really ask for.